Well, thank you very much to the Nimitz Foundation, to Lauren, to all of you for being here, and to the wonderful talks that we've had so far. On the morning of June 17th, 1945, Captain James F. Nolan, MD, boarded a plane in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and in his briefcase was a highly sensitive report prepared by Nolan and some of the other Manhattan Project physicians and two scientists that expressed concerns about potential radioactive fallout from the upcoming Trinity test. The plutonium bomb, or gadget as it was called, was scheduled for detonation in the Alamogordo bombing range in less than a month. Nolan and his colleagues hoped to persuade General Leslie Groves about their concerns and to approve safety and evacuation procedures for the Trinity test. So Nolan traveled from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge and handed Groves the report. Groves, who was not at all pleased to receive the report, made Nolan sit outside his office while he read the documents and discussed it with his top aides. When he finished, Groves called Nolan in and addressed him dismissively. He said, "What are you, some kind of Hearst propagandist?" So here's an image of that very encounter. It's an opera. This is the opera Dr. Atomic, and this is from one at the Met in 2011 in New York. And what you see here is Nolan confronting Groves, singing it in this case, and Groves responding, singing, "What are you, some kind of Hearst propagandist?" Well, as Nolan saw it, Groves cared little about matters of health and safety. America was at war, and developing the bomb for the purposes of winning the war was his primary concern. So this required security and secrecy. As Nolan recalled, radiation hazards were entirely secondary. Nolan remembers Groves that he had, as he put it, rifle barrel vision, and this enabled him to be a great soldier, but limited him to thinking only of the security aspect. Well, Dr. Nolan was my grandfather, and about 12 years ago, after my dad passed away, I was given a box of materials that no one in the family, except my dad, even knew existed. And it includes my grandfather's military records, photographs, correspondence, including with Robert Oppenheimer, artifacts, and some of his own reflections on his unique journey through the dawn of the nuclear age. Now, this journey included running the post hospital in Los Alamos. And here's a slide of the hospital in its early years, and it shows that it was so small that visitors had to stand outside if they were going to visit patients inside the hospital. He was one of the very first recruits to the Hill. Oppenheimer wanted a hospital and doctors and nurses in place so that he could recruit the top physicists to Los Alamos. So there is my grandfather with his family, my grandmother, my dad standing there, and his daughter, who was the first child to be born at the military site in Los Alamos. So his main responsibility was running the hospital. For those of you who saw the movie, there's that scene where Oppenheimer and Groves are talking, and Groves is scolding Oppenheimer for all the babies that are being born in Los Alamos. And he says, 80 alone have been born in this first year, and you're doing nothing about it. And then, of course, Kitty Oppenheimer walks up, and she's pregnant, and Oppenheimer's like, "You're right, I'm not doing anything about it." And my grandfather was an OBGYN with training in radiology, and he delivered all 80 of those babies, including his own daughter and including the Oppenheimer's daughter, Tony, during his time in Los Alamos. He had a reputation for being a good doctor, but also having a kind of sardonic wit. And I met one of the, now obviously a grown man who's now a physicist, who had been delivered by my grandfather, and I was at a conference, and he introduced himself, and he told me the wonderful story of his mom, Rose Frisch, who was one of my grandfather's patients. And when she was visiting him in the hospital, the Los Alamos Hospital, during their appointment, she says that she needs to go to the restroom. And he said, "Oh, no, you don't. I've lost too many babies down the toilet that way," and would not allow her to go. And so there are lots of stories like that of his wit, of the way in which he would deal with people in that way. And of course, I was 20 years old when he passed away, and I remember that wit as well. In addition to running the hospital, he also participated in the Trinity test. In fact, he was in charge of the health and evacuation procedures for the Trinity test. And again, this wit comes out here as well, because he was very concerned, as I'll talk about issues of radiation. And he tells the story of some of the scientists wanting to know how much radiation they could be exposed to. And the doctors had difficulty trying to determine how much they could be exposed to. And so when the scientists would ask them that, he would say, well, how much do you want? like putting it back on them. He also literally carried the bomb from Los Alamos to Tinian Island. He carried the uranium-235. He carried it aboard the USS Indianapolis. He carried, I think it was 60% of the uranium-235. The other part came by plane later. He also then, after the war, went into Japan as part of the Joint Commission to assess the damage. And then after the war, he was part of the radiation safety team that operated in the Marshall Islands, monitoring exposure to radiation. So he had a very unique journey through the dawn of the nuclear age, and he was one of the key atomic doctors who were part of the Manhattan Project. And the other two that I pay close attention to were Louis Hempelmann and Stafford Warren. There are others who I pay attention to, including the Japanese doctors that the Manhattan Project doctors worked with in Japan. But these are the three doctors. This is from Ferenc Chase's book, The Day the Sun Rose Twice, an excellent book on the Trinity test. So Louis Hempelmann, my grandfather there on the right, and then Stafford Warren. And Stafford Warren was actually located at Oak Ridge, very important person. He was the head physician, and Louis Hempelmann and my grandfather were both at Los Alamos. Hempelmann was a civilian, and my grandfather entered the military simply for the purposes of being on the Manhattan Project. There are a number of the doctors recruited over time, and nurses. My grandfather played the role of recruiting the nurses to Los Alamos, and most of them were recruited from St. Louis, Washington University. That's where many of them came from. And what I found in following the journey of these three doctors was a pattern whereby the doctors were concerned about radiation exposure. They would warn the military regarding radiation hazards, but these were not always taken seriously. The doctors were then used by the military often to cover up or to downplay the damages of radiation exposure, and often it was out of concerns about litigation. And it's a pattern of what I call caution, co-optation, and complicity. And I'm going to give you three examples of this pattern that I witnessed following my grandfather and these other doctors' journey through the nuclear age. Now, Alan made reference to the pre-Trinity test, and in military parlance, it was referred to as TR1. So the actual Trinity test was TR2, but this is TR1. And my grandfather's main duty was running the hospital, but over time, he was pulled into the health group by Louis Hempelmann. And as the Trinity test approached, and he moved over to the health group, his concerns were mostly focused on safety and health for those who were participating in the Trinity test. So his work in the lab was really limited because he quickly shifted and was assigned to set up the safety and evacuation procedures for the Trinity test. And the Trinity test was preceded by this pre-test that took place on May 7th, 1945. And Nolan was there for the 100 tons, or I guess 108-ton TNT pre-test. And in preparation for this test, Warren and Hempelmann added some radioactive material to the pile of TNT in order to observe anticipated fallout effects. Two scientists joined them in their concerns about radioactive fallout, Joseph Hirschfelder and John McGee. And based on the test, Hirschfelder and McGee calculated that the radioactive fallout would be significant. In a June 16th memo to Kenneth Bainbridge, who was the scientific head of the Trinity test, Hirschfelder and McGee said this: "There is definite danger of dust containing active material and fission products falling on towns near Trinity and necessitating their evacuation." Now, their calculations, again, were based in part on the results of this 100-ton test. Now listen to what Hempelman says in recalling this. He says, if they, that is Hirschfelder and McGee, had been correct, we really shouldn't have done that test after they came out with their first calculations, but the efforts of the laboratory was directed at trying to disprove them. In other words, this was not welcome information or evidence, and the scientists sought to disprove or downplay the results. So what happens next? Well, Hempelman continues. Hirschfelder and McGee corrected their calculations, and they came up with radiation levels that were high, but they weren't as bad as they'd been before. So the doctors anticipated that there was going to be radiological fallout, and they warned the military about this, thus my grandfather's encounter with Groves. However, given the pressing scientific concerns with wanting to see if they could make a nuclear explosion and military concerns with having a weapon for the purposes of warfare, the tests went forward. And there were also, of course, enormous diplomatic and international pressures to test the bomb. Truman was meeting with Stalin and Churchill in Potsdam. The Potsdam meeting had already been delayed once, and Truman wanted to know if the bomb could work in order to be in a position of strength with Russia for diplomatic reasons. So there was pressure to move forward with testing the bomb. The doctors did finally prevail upon Groves to allow them to put some safety measures and evacuation plans in place, and Nolan was put in charge of making these arrangements. However, Nolan learned in early July that he would be asked to carry the core explosive material of the Hiroshima bomb, little boy, from Los Alamos to Tinian Island, and this was, again, the core uranium-235, the only processed uranium in the world, estimated at the time to cost more than $300 million, excuse me. Because of this mission, Nolan left New Mexico on July 14th. On the morning of July 16th, the day of the Trinity test, Nolan was on board the USS Indianapolis, and with little boy bolted to the floor of the flag lieutenant's cabin. And he was sitting there with his Geiger counter, monitoring, babysitting little boy, if you will. Warren and Hempelman, who were both involved in following through with the safety and evacuation measures, were very worried about what would happen from the fallout, and the question is, well, what happened? Well, both concluded after the Trinity test that they were very lucky, that it could have been much worse, and there was, in fact, significant fallout. In a secret handwritten letter to my grandfather that I found in my box of materials, so a letter that Warren wrote to my grandfather and sent to him on Tinian Island, this is what Warren wrote. He said, we found 30 to 40 R. R is a Röntgen, our measurement of radiation exposure. We found 30 to 40 R total near a lot of houses and one hot canyon northeast of Bingham, totaling 230 R. Boy, what a narrow escape. If we had laid it down in a steady wind as planned, when you left, we would have had high mortality, which he underlines and then puts 2 exclamation points afterwards. I think it's an important admission there. In this letter, Warren added at the end, after some kind of personal things, he says, it was terrific. You missed a show, but you will live longer as a result. Another sort of admission. In a 1986 interview, Hempelman acknowledged that people had been affected by radiation and even admitted that they essentially had gotten away with it. As he put it, a few people were probably overexposed, but they couldn't prove it, and we couldn't prove it, so we just assumed we got away with it. The doctors also acknowledged that there was pressure not to investigate fallout further. As Warren put it, no one really wanted to pursue radiation possibilities for fear of getting involved in litigation. The Army and the government lawyers were scared of legal complications. They wanted to put it all out of sight and mind as quickly as possible. That's what Warren said. So we see this pattern that I've mentioned. Doctors warned about the effects of radiation. Their concerns were not taken entirely seriously. The doctors then became complicit in hiding the effects, and they did so at least in part out of concerns about litigation. And then there's a picture of the Trinity explosion. All right, that's my first example. My second example is the journey into Japan. Now, days after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, news accounts start coming out of Japan reporting ongoing radiation poisoning. And Groves was a bit shaken by this news, and not so much because of the effects of radiation poisoning on the Japanese, but because of how these reports might affect public perceptions of the Manhattan Project's production and use of an atomic bomb. Initial and residual radiation could be likened to biological or chemical warfare, and Groves feared having to give an account for what could justifiably be seen as an inhumane, and by some perspectives, illegal form of combat. And Groves wanted to get a first-hand assessment of the effects of radiation to counter the so-called propaganda coming out of Japan. So a group from the Manhattan Project was put together to go into Japan immediately after the surrender, and my grandfather was among this group, which also included Stafford Warren. So the formal surrender of Japan to the United States occurred on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. And on September 5th, just 3 days after that, my grandfather's group landed in Yokohama to begin their investigation of the damage in Japan. And there were actually 3 groups that made up the investigation: an Army group, a Navy group, and the Manhattan Project group. And they would then be joined by the Japanese doctors. So it was called the Joint Commission. And so it essentially was comprised of 4 groups. And the Japanese doctor who was in charge of the Japanese delegation was Dr. Masao Suzuki. And there's a picture of him. He was a leading Tokyo-based surgeon who would serve as the group's translator and guide. He was a very, very interesting guy. He had studied in the United States. He could speak English. And on September 7th, the group met with him. And the 52-year-old Suzuki had, 2 decades earlier, spent time at the University of Pennsylvania as a student and researcher. And though largely cooperative with the American doctors, he could also be quite acerbic and critical. And during this initial meeting with the American investigators, which was comprised of doctors, a few scientists, as well as military personnel. And so in this meeting, he takes his 1926 thesis, which was an investigation on the damaging effects of radiation on rabbits, and hands it to Phil Morrison. And Morrison thumbs through it, hands it back to him, and then Suzuki slaps the American physicist on the knee, and he said, but the Americans, they are wonderful. It has remained for them to conduct the human experiment. And throughout the time with him, he would say these types of things. He would kind of needle the Americans and kind of say, like this is what's been done here. The next morning, on September 8th, the party, which included Warren, Nolan, Suzuki, along with 2 generals, Thomas Farrell and James Newman, and a Swiss Red Cross doctor named Marcel Ginned, made their way to Hiroshima. And this is just in my grandfather's files. This is just to show you Suzuki's English skills. This is a note from him telling them a place to meet, as well as cards from Suzuki and some of the other Japanese doctors with whom the Joint Commission worked. This of course, is a note to Colonel Warren and other gentlemen, as you can see. Okay, so they made their way to Hiroshima, and this is a photo of them as they arrived. And interestingly, the Japanese had prepared a little tea ceremony. You see the chairs and so forth set up. That bus in the background is what they eventually take to make their way into Hiroshima. But this is at the Iwakuni airport, and in the middle there is Marcel Ginned, who's a Red Cross doctor, who actually the Japanese think very highly of. There's actually, outside the Hiroshima Memorial Peace Museum, there's a monument dedicated to Ginned for his efforts in helping to help and serve and provide medical care to the Hibakusha in Hiroshima. Well, after spending the night on a resort island called Miyajima in the Hiroshima Bay, the next morning, September 9th, Nolan, Warren, and others set out for Hiroshima. And here are pictures from my grandfather's papers of Hiroshima as they made their way to the epicenter of the explosion. So they're moving their way into the epicenter, and here are some of the pictures that he took with his camera. Later in his life, his nephew pressed him on what he saw in Japan. He never ever talked about it. I never remember a single conversation with him about what he saw in Japan. And anyway, his nephew pressed him, and the only thing he said that it was utter devastation of the kind that is difficult to imagine. That's the only thing that Bill Reynolds was his name, remembers him saying. Well, on their first day in Hiroshima, Nolan and Warren could ascertain, even at this early stage of their investigation, that there was no doubt that there was gamma radiation injury and that there was a slight amount of radioactivity on the ground. The two Manhattan Project doctors, aided by Tsuzuki and Hitoshi Motohashi, another Japanese doctor and translator, visited a number of makeshift hospitals around Hiroshima. And here's a photo of my grandfather with Tsuzuki observing a habakasha outside. Again, this is outside of Hiroshima. That's John Flick, an ophthalmologist. And I love this picture because I think it depicts Tsuzuki in the way he would talk to them, like he's instructing them and telling them about what's happened to the habakasha. Here's another picture. Well, just to give you one example, there was one time when he was talking to the American doctors and he's explaining things to them, and he says, infection of the blood, white corpuscles almost entirely destroyed, gamma rays, nothing to be done about it. She'll be dead this evening or tomorrow. That's what an atomic bomb does. And here's a picture of Warren and Nolan and Motohashi, and they're looking at specimens. So they did a lot of this. In fact, they took a lot of these specimens home to the United States. I was recently contacted by someone who had read my book, and he has in his possession the skull of a victim from Nagasaki, and he's wanting to figure out how to return it and how he should do it. And this is one of the kind of sources of resentment, is that some of these specimens and autopsy materials the Americans brought back to the United States. Here's another one of my grandfather and John Flick and two Kyoto researchers. And I was told, and I learned this from the Japanese, some scholars there, that these were actually two men who were involved in the Japanese nuclear program, that is, the building of the bomb. And both of them were killed by a mudslide at this hospital that happened after a typhoon. Here, that's an example of kind of, these are some pictures of what happened on the ground when they were in Hiroshima. What's happening in the United States? Well, this is September 9th, the day that Nolan and Warren made it into Hiroshima. Groves and Oppenheimer assembled a group of some 31 news correspondents and photographers, along with a handful of scientists and a dozen military men at the Trinity site. And the purpose for this gathering was, in part, to counter the disturbing news coming out of Japan. Here's a second image, and this is interesting. During the photo op, Groves and Oppenheimer explained that while the gadget at the Trinity site was detonated at only 100 feet above the ground, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were exploded much higher, about 1,500, 1,650 feet respectively, in order to avoid depositing residual radiation on the ground. Now, Oppenheimer said the Japanese heights of explosion were picked so that there would be no indirect chemical warfare due to poisoning the earth with radioactive elements, and no horrors other than the familiar ones due to any great explosion. Now, this is a slightly misleading statement in two respects. First, the radiation horrors as such were not avoided in Japan, and second, the real purpose for the higher explosion was to cause the greatest amount of damage from the blast. If it's lower down, the blast goes into the ground, and that's wasted energy. It's true that it resulted in less residual radiation on the ground, but that wasn't the reason for it being blasted up higher. Groves admitted that some Japanese may have died from radioactivity, but that the information now available indicates that this number was relatively small. Now recall that Groves was making this statement on the same day that his first members of the Joint Commission had finally arrived in Hiroshima. And during the photo op, Louis Hempelmann was carrying a Geiger counter testing radiation levels at the site. And he became so concerned at the levels that he finally warned Oppenheimer to move the assembled party. And here's a picture with Hempelmann and Oppenheimer, and Hempelmann is holding the radiation measuring instrument right next to Oppenheimer. And incidentally, they were close friends, Oppenheimer and Louis Hempelmann. During the 1954 tribunal that's featured in the movie, his two kids stayed with the Hempelmanns during that time, to give you some example of the nature of their friendship. Groves would eventually testify before Congress 2 months later, November 28th, 1945, and here he was even more deceptive in terms of what he communicated. This is just one more image of that gathering of people at the Trinity site. When he was asked if there was any residual radiation on the ground in Japan, he stated rather unequivocally, he says, there is none, That is a very positive none. Most incredibly and inaccurately, he stated that very few died from exposure to radiation, and of the few who did, he stated, quote, "I understand it from the doctors that they did so without undue suffering. In fact, they," that is the doctors, "say it is a very pleasant way to die." Now, I've seen the report that Warren and Nolan prepared for Groves for that testimony, and they say nothing of the sort. In fact, they detail quite explicitly some of the very horrible effects of radiation exposure and of the number of people who were dying when they were still there. So the dying from radiation exposure continued, and they witnessed it when they were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, even before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the doctors had warned Groves about the potential damage from radiation exposure. On July 25th, 1945, that is before both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, Warren wrote a memo to General Groves telling him what to expect concerning radiation exposure to American troops after a nuclear explosion. Now notice this is American troops walking into a nuclear explosion after a bomb. And at the end of this memo, he draws out a sketch of what he calls probabilities for normal active troops. So here's that chart. Is that all clear? Can everyone read that? Here's a cleaned up version of it. And so again, this is what he says. The following is an oversimplified table of probabilities for normal active troops. That is, active troops going into a site after a nuclear explosion. And you can see here that it depends on how long you're there, and then there's variation even within that in terms of the type of damage that can occur. However, he does say that if you're there for a couple weeks in this spot, you could have an exposure of up to 300 Roentgen, and that could result in significant damage. Right? So this is in the memo. This is at the end of the memo that he gives to Groves on July 25th, 1945. 5 days later, Groves wrote to General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, in which he grossly misrepresented Warren's warnings. Groves wrote to Marshall, "No damaging effects are anticipated on the ground from radioactive materials. We think we could move troops through the area immediately, preferably by motor, but on foot if desired." Well, since publishing my book, files from Stafford Warren were discovered. His files are at UCLA. He went on to become the first dean of the UCLA Med School, so that's where his files are. And conspicuously missing from his thousands of pages of files, are the Trinity, his Trinity test files. Those have recently been discovered, and I was asked to review them, and they're now at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. But in that material, which I went through, I found an annotated sketch of this same chart, which suggests that Warren's concerns were even greater than what he ultimately reported to Groves. That is, he notes that in instances where military personnel were to occupy an area for 30 days after an atomic explosion, for 50% of them, it would be lethal, and for 100%, it would result in permanent damage. Warren also sketches out possible dosages of up to 1,000 Roentgen and adds the troubling annotation, "lethal in 5 days with bloody diarrhea." He also clarifies that what he is warning about only concerns total body external gamma radiation and does not include estimates of internal dosage, such as ingestion or inhalation. That is, even what he estimates would not constitute the totality of radiation hazards. Not measured, for example, would be the impact of alpha particles, beta particles, and neutron penetration. Thus, the memo suggests that Warren's concerns were even greater than what he ultimately communicated to Groves. And again, what Groves reported to Marshall concerning this data was that no damaging effects are anticipated on the ground from radioactive materials. We think we could move troops through the area immediately, preferably by motor, but on foot if desired. So again, my point here, this pattern, the doctors warned the military about radiation. These warnings were either downplayed, ignored, or outright distorted. Back in Japan, this is something I didn't anticipate, but was incredibly heartwarming, was that when they worked together in the Joint Commission, the Japanese doctors and the American doctors developed a great deal of affection for one another. They became quite friendly, and it's something that was reported over and over again. And this is a photo of the members of the Joint Commission in Nagasaki, and that's Stafford Warren holding a Japanese doll, Henry Barnett to the right, was a pediatrician. He was the next kind of doctor recruited to Los Alamos after Hempelman and Nolan. Anyway, you see this is a group of them who work together. And again, the point what I found was this very interesting kind of reports from both sides about how much they liked one another. So on October 6th, the Manhattan Project group departed from Omura, which is north of Nagasaki, to begin their journey to the United States. And before leaving, Dr. Shirabi from the Nagasaki Medical School met up with and exchanged gifts with Henry Barnett, who's shown there, Joe Howland, and some of the other American doctors. And Shirabi gave color prints and fans to the Americans, while Barnett offered Shirabi and Dr. Kitamura large packages of cigarettes. But there was this, again, this kind of a gift exchange and affection. And here's an image, incidentally, of a fan that my grandfather brought back with him. And you see there, signed, are Tuzuki, Motohashi, Stafford Warren, some of the other doctors, both Japanese and Americans that he worked with in Japan. Anyway, Shirabi and Kitamura were close with Henry Barnett, and here's a picture of the two of them, Nagasaki doctors. And Shirabi noticed that the American doctors were excited about going back to their homeland, and in his view, the collaboration had been a great success. I think we accomplished the objective of American-Japanese friendship, he put it. In particular, Shirabi remembered Dr. Barnett as a friendly person who always remembered his name. Well, tensions clearly lurked in the background, and there were, some tensions. Particularly, there was concerns about the taking of the material, right, the autopsy material in the slides, as well as the destruction of the Japanese cyclotron, and also the no treatment policy. The Joint Commission was not supposed to offer treatment to the Hibakusha. They broke that rule sometimes, but the official policy was a no treatment policy. Incidentally, a policy that continued with the Atomic Bomb Casualty Committee that followed the Joint Commission, and then more recently the newest iteration continues to have a kind of no treatment policy. In terms of the friendship, Stafford Warren told the story of being presented with ancient samurai swords from Tuzuki Motohashi in Tokyo in the days just before the Americans were to return to the United States. And when asked if there was any hostility between him and the Japanese doctors, Warren said, "No, not a bit. We had been together for 6 weeks, and these two Japanese officers were in our party. We liked each other." And one of my favorite, and again, there's a number of testimonies like this on both sides, but one of my favorite is there was a 42-year-old Japanese pathologist, Dr. Hachiya, at the hospital in Hiroshima. And he remembered very fondly working alongside Captain J. Philip Loge, a physician from Ashley Otterson's group. And Dr. Loge, he said, was a young medical doctor who came to my hospital every day and spent all his spare time examining patients. Hachiya wrote in a postscript to his book, Hiroshima Diary, he said, "Though we could not speak the same tongue, we understood each other's feelings. He was a gentleman, and all my staff and patients became fond of him." And then generalizing as to the benefits of this successful collaboration, Hachiya concluded, "There is no boundary where sympathy and understanding are present." I love that line. There is no boundary where sympathy and understanding are present. Okay, my final example. Operation Crossroads, July 1946. Now, the plan was to use the ships captured from Germany and Japan, as well as some older American vessels, and to test the effects of a nuclear attack on these. In total, 94 target ships were used. Now, the original plan was to subject these ships to 3 tests. There was going to be a dropping the bomb from the air, a detonation about 90 feet under the water, and then a deep sea detonation. They were the Able, Baker, and Charlie tests. That's what they were going to do. And my grandfather went there as part of the radiation safety group, or the RAD-SAFE group, as they called it. And he was recruited once again by Stafford Warren. So Stafford Warren was there as well, and he kind of headed up the group. And here he is aboard the USS Mount McKinley with other RAD-SAFE monitors. Now, Operation Crossroads would eventually include 42,000 military and civilian personnel, as well as press, members of Congress, and invited dignitaries from around the world, including representatives from Russia. So the first test, the Able test, took place on July 1st, 1946, and then the second, the Baker test, took place on July 15th, 1946. The Able bomb was at least initially seen as less spectacular and destructive than anticipated, However, the blast did sink 5 ships, including 2 destroyers, and immobilized 6 others. Moreover, fires broke out on about 23 target ships. The Baker test, the one seen here, detonated, again, 90 feet below the surface of the Bikini Island Lagoon, lifted 2 million tons of water more than 1 mile into the air. And the mushroom cloud of radioactive material extended nearly 3 miles wide and then rained down on the entire fleet of target ships. The explosion sank 9 ships and seriously damaged dozens of others. Well, in spite of the warnings from the RadSafe team, military personnel were eager to see the effects on their ships. And after both tests, the overworked RadSafe monitors had difficulty getting the military to heed their warnings about the hazards of radiation fallout. And among the first boats to be tested was the Skate submarine. And as reported in the New York Times the next day, my grandfather was the one who went out and tested with a Geiger counter the Skate, and it said in the New York Times that a small picket boat went up to the Skate to test the level of radiation. It was so high that his Geiger counter was off the scale. And he reported this to Admiral William Blandy, who was the military head of the Operation Crossroads, and Admiral Blandy's response was indicative of the general attitude of the Navy in this instance. Wanting to demonstrate the invincibility of his fleet, Blandy was disposed to underemphasize the nature and extent of the damage. Thus, the high level of radiation found near the surface of the Skate was not welcome information. Blandy turned to James Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy, and explained with a laugh, "Nolan's counter was so delicate that my luminous watch dial would make it go off the scale." And notice this. So this is, you see the warning there, right? Keep clear, danger, very, very radioactive. Well, just a couple days after this, the crew of the Skate ignored these warnings and boarded the Skate. There they are. And saluted Admiral Blandy as he cruised by on the USS Mount McKinley. Robert Henderson, who was a member of the Los Alamos assembly team, recalled, "That submarine was hotter than hell, but here is the Navy, all gung-ho, lining up sailors and showing that it was invincible." Another one was the USS New York, and there's my grandfather aboard the USS New York with a Geiger counter testing levels of radiation. In this case, the ship was deemed as kind of radiologically safe. However, after the Baker test, it was found to be highly irradiated. In fact, both the Skate and the USS New York eventually had to be sunk in the Pacific because they were so irradiated. The Navy, however, thought that they could salvage the ships and scrub off the radiation. The US New York was one of the first ships in which they attempted to do this. They tried various methods of scrubbing the radiation off the decks of the ships, and all their efforts failed, and many of the sailors, as a consequence, were exposed to radiation. And here's one picture of these efforts of trying to scrub the radiation off the surface of the ships. The doctors at this point are getting very, very concerned. The levels of radiation that they're measuring are very high. They're even finding measurements aboard some of the non-target ships, including the USS Haven, which was the medical ship, and they were trying to warn the military about this. But because radiation couldn't be smelled or felt or tasted, the military officers resisted the warnings from the RadSafe team. Well, eventually, Stafford Warren gets, in the lagoon, the fish were radiated, they were eating the algae, and they themselves were very radiated. And as a consequence, you would take one of these fish from the lagoon and place it on an X-ray, a piece of X-ray film, and it would leave an imprint. And this is an example of this. And especially, you see the stomach, how it's bright there. That's because of the food, eating from the algae. So Warren takes one of these things and brings it to Blandy and says, we just can't, we got to get out of here. And Blandy says to Warren, if that is it, then we call it a halt. So they canceled the Charlie tests. They got the ships out of the Bikini Lagoon. And Warren writes to his, relieved Warren, wrote to his wife, quote, "A self-X-ray of the fish did the trick." So this is how they were able to end Operation Crossroads. What was occurred at Trinity, the doctors were concerned about lawsuits. They had set up a medical legal board, and again, basically kind of try to cover themselves and make sure that they couldn't get in trouble. Literally, this was their motivation. The board's function was to reassure Colonel Warren that the safety measures adopted by RadSafe were such as to attract no justifiable criticism and to give what assurance was possible that no suits could be brought on account of the radiological hazards of Operation Crossroads. Okay, so let me conclude by bringing us to 1983. It was a big year. It's the first time Ronald Reagan used the term evil empire in reference to the Soviet Union. It was the year that the apocalyptic film The Day After was released and viewed by more than 100 million people, including Reagan, who was reportedly deeply affected by it. In 1983, it was also the 40th year of the start of the Manhattan Project, and they held an anniversary, a kind of gathering in Los Alamos. In April of 1983, a reunion was held, and for more than about 100 people who were part of that first wave of people who went to Los Alamos. And my grandfather was in attendance at this reunion. In fact, if you look up in the top there, you see the exit sign in that little alcove. That's my grandfather standing there, as well as a lot of the other first people who were in Los Alamos from the very beginning. Interestingly, Bill Moyers did a documentary on this. He was present, and he interviewed a number of the physicists, and a lot of them, someone asked a question about this earlier, a lot of them are expressing kind of some regret about what had become of their invention. The physicist Isidore Rabi, for example, said of Los Alamos that it was an abomination. We should have put this thing to rest 30 years ago at least. I feel sorrow that the place still exists. The Nobel Prize-winning German physicist Hans Bethe stated that while he was happy to see his old friends, he had serious regrets about what had been done at the site. He said, "We did a terrible job here. What we produced is a great threat to the world." A petition signed by 70 scientists during the reunion, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, stated, "We are appalled at the present level of the nuclear armaments of the nations of the world, and we are profoundly frightened for the future of humanity." And they acknowledged their own special sense of responsibility. And I should note that my grandfather did not sign that petition. So what could they celebrate at this reunion if there's this kind of regret? Well, Peter Wyden, in his account of it, writes of the event in his book, Day One. He says, "The most lionized of the alumni was former Captain James F. Nolan, MD, the obstetrician who had delivered so many of the scientists' children on the Mesa during the war. Dorothy McKibben, who was the cheerful and industrious gatekeeper for the Manhattan Project, also seems to have recognized this as Nolan's most significant contribution. In early 1952, she sent Nolan a clipping from the Santa Fe newspaper, The New Mexican, announcing the dedication of a new $2.5 million hospital in Los Alamos. And fittingly, featured on the front page of the issue is a photograph of a woman holding her newborn, the first baby to occupy the nursery of the new medical center, and scrawled at the top of the page, commending Nolan's legacy, is a handwritten letter by McKibben, which says, "See what you started, Jim?" in reference to the hospital. Just a couple months after this reunion, my grandfather died of a heart attack at the age of 68, and he had a heart condition that has been associated with radiation exposure. And he acknowledged that he had all sorts of radiation exposure, not necessarily from his military service, but from his role as a doctor, as a radiologist. So here's my final slide, and this is an image of my grandfather after the war, supervising the examination of obstetrical patients in St. Louis. At the time, he was on the faculty of the Washington University Medical School before he moved to Los Angeles later that year. After the war, Hempelman continued to live in Santa Fe and work in the lab for a number of years. He also was a researcher for a time in Rochester, New York, and he as I said, became very close with Oppenheimer. Warren became the dean of the UCLA Medical School, as I mentioned, and worked mainly in administrative duties after the war. So of the 3 doctors, Nolan was the only one who went back to being a doctor. And he was very keen to get out of the military and get back to work as a medical researcher and practitioner. He went on to have a rather illustrious career as a gynecological oncologist. He's one of the first people to be given that label as a doctor. And he, as I mentioned, rarely talked about his experience on the Manhattan Project. And it's not surprising. This was mentioned earlier, right? People just didn't talk about it. But even in his papers, I found several times where he had to sign something saying, I will not talk about this with others, and to do so would be basically an act of treason. So again, as I said, I never once talked to him about his experience on the Manhattan Project. My grandfather, again, rarely talked about it, and when people did ask him about his time in Los Alamos and his role on the Manhattan Project, he would typically reply, "Oh, I just delivered the babies." That's what he would say. "I just delivered the babies." Thus, Nolan's nephew, Bill Reynolds, the one to whom he said of Hiroshima and Nagasaki there was utter devastation of the likes that's difficult to imagine, Bill Reynolds also said that he thought the most fitting epitaph for Nolan would be that his uncle, and the one that his uncle would have chosen would simply have been, "I delivered the babies." Thank you.
All right, we have some time for questions. Please remember to wait for the mic runners to come to you with the mics so that our virtual audience can hear you. All right, questions. I saw here in the green shirt, third row back, was our first hand.
Would you stand up?
Thank you. One thing that really struck me as you were talking was the fact that your grandfather was chosen to carry the uranium. Was that some kind of signal or response? It seems a little strange that a doctor would have been chosen to perform that activity. Was there any kind of indication that there was a particular, purpose behind it other than just needing somebody to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, Alan and I were talking about this earlier, because some people who have read my book wonder if they were trying to get rid of him, because here he was, challenging groves, concerned about radiation, and then this is something they did. They would just send someone to a remote place. I have heard that Pierre da Silva, who carried the other part of the uranium-235 aboard 3 separate planes, so 3 planes carried 3 parts, and that there was some reason to get him out of Los Alamos because he was one of the people who was doing the surveillance on Oppenheimer and thought he was a Soviet spy and causing all sorts of problems. So let's send him away. So people have offered that. I don't have any empirical evidence to suggest that that's true. And I think also, Alan and I were talking about this, it was kind of like seen as a good role, right? Tinian is like where they're going to take off, right? And I know that my grandfather himself thought it was a good thing. And the kind of stated reason was that they needed someone who knew something about radiation. So he was the kind of scientific medical courier, and then they had a military courier, a guy named Robert Furman, who was one of Groves's top aides. He'd been part of the Alsos project, the espionage project that went into Europe to try to determine how far along the Germans were in making a bomb. That's who he was. And Furman himself never, ever talked about his experience. I interviewed his son, and his son said he never, ever talked about it. So that was the stated ostensible reason, is that it needed a kind of scientific medical. And then when he got to Tinian, he was the doctor for the 509th composite. And so when the Enola Gay crew returned from Hiroshima, he did a medical examination of them, gave them all a medicinal shot of whiskey. And some of them were concerned, for example, about issues of fertility. Some of them had eye issues, and he wrote. I've seen his medical examination of the Enola Gay crew after they came back. Yeah.
So my question is, when they did the Trinity test, test 2 with the tower, the radioactive cloud, as I recall, and what I've read, drifted off to the northeast, and there were, among other things, there were cows that were affected, and then the milk was affected. Do you have some information about either sickness in animals and or humans because of the radioactive cloud?
Yeah, so this is a very important and contested issue. Right now there's kind of political activity to try to get some recognition for the so-called Trinity downwinders. In terms of the cows, that's documented. There are pictures of them, and there was nuclear fallout such that their fur was affected. So if you look at some of these cows, they had beta burns, and literally the fur would turn white. Hempelman talks about this, and they brought some of them up to Los Alamos, actually. Okay, yeah, and then they took the others. They shipped the others elsewhere Tennessee? Did they take them to Oak Ridge? Okay. Okay, they went to Oak Ridge. And so they did kind of keep an eye on this, and Hempelman talks about it, writes about it. That was very real, very much documented, the effects on the cow. And it's contested about just exactly what the fallout effects were in Trinity, and it's an ongoing area that people are continuing to do research on. But I think that it's recognized that there was, in fact, fallout, and that there were, in fact, people affected by it, that there were higher cancer rates in certain areas where the cloud went after the explosion. Yeah.
All right, we have a question from our virtual audience over here.
Do either targets still show residual radiation after all these years?
And when you say the two targets, we mean Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
I
Yeah.
would assume so.
Yeah. So that also was something that was kind of looked at and considered by both the American and the Japanese doctors. The Japanese doctors and scientists had already done some work before the Americans showed up. And there was, as I mentioned, and it's clear from the people who did the testing, Stafford Warren, Collins was a guy who did a lot of documentation of it, that there was residual radiation. It wasn't a huge amount, and that the half-life was such that it decreased quickly in terms of the ongoing effects of residual radiation, but it was very real at the time, and there's all sorts of documentation of people who weren't even in Nagasaki or Hiroshima, but that went in afterwards to help people who got radiation sickness. And that's pretty well documented as well. Even the Japanese government, which was hesitant to offer kind of medical compensation, eventually recognized that for people who kind of went in afterwards. So the residual radiation was real. It did dissipate fairly quickly, and it is actually true that it dissipated more quickly, for example, than the Trinity site, because the explosion was higher. Even though that wasn't the intention, that was the effect. Yeah.
You got the box from your grandfather when you were 20? No?
No, I got the box 12 years ago.
Oh, you got the box 12
My
years ago.
grandfather died when I was 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you dive in immediately? Were you already interested in the topic? Like, what was sort of the timeline of seeing that and then deciding you were going to do this extensive amount of research and write about it?
Yeah. So the answer is I didn't get into it right away. I was finishing up another book project at the time, and I finished that. But I held on to it, and I would kind of dive into it occasionally and look at the pictures and try to make sense of the correspondence and decipher, for example, some of the kind of handwriting. And then eventually, once I finished that book and it was published, then I dove into it. And it really wasn't. It has important, significant information in and of itself. But it also was, in certain ways, just the kind of beginning for me. I actually visited 20 different archives in the United States and Japan in the course of my research to dig further. A lot of those pictures that I showed you were actually from I got in the archives of the Hiroshima Memorial Peace Museum, the ones of my grandfather in the hospitals in Hiroshima. But some of the other ones of the damage and so forth, those were his pictures that were in the file. So it was something I got into a couple years after I inherited it, and then it actually led to additional research in lots of other places. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Other than raising the alarm to Groves, as your grandfather did, I think before Trinity, what was his expectation, or did he make a recommendation given, the very short timeline notifying Truman of how effective the bomb was? What did your grandfather want to happen?
Yeah. One of the things that the Joint Commission recommended several times was that a journalist once wrote of the Joint Commission that they did a spot check. It's pretty fair, actually. They were only there 5 or 6 weeks. But one of the things that the Joint Commission people said is we need to test the long-term effects of radiation. That was something that they said and that they recommended. So that actually helped bring about the ABCC, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, that then became the RERF, Radiation Effects Radiation Foundation, which continues today to test the consequences, the long-term consequences of the effects of radiation on Hibakusha and the offspring of Hibakusha. So that was one of their main sources of recommendation. But within the time frame of the Trinity test and then even the Marshall Islands, they did offer warnings. I mean, there was real warnings that they offered. But both, certainly during the war, Warren and Nolan were military, and they had to kind of respond to their officers. Like they didn't have a lot of grounds upon which to push these further. There's a great story of Ed Collins, and he was basically an expert on radiation measuring instruments, and he was recruited, and he was sent to Tinian to be part of the Joint Commission. And he shows up on Tinian Island, and General Farrell announces their mission, like, this is what you're going to do. And Ed Collins, like my grandfather, they weren't military guys. They were pulled in to serve for this particular project. And in Tinian, Farrell says, your mission is to go in and find out that there is no radiation. Ed Collins goes, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to go in to find out if there is radiation? And Stafford Warren pulls him aside and he goes, you're not supposed to speak back to a commanding officer. And so that's kind of like, you're limited in what you can do in terms of, and I think Stafford Warren, for example, I mean, he had very real concerns about things. His wife, I think Viola is her name, talked about, is it Viola? She remembers after the Bikini Island tests, right, that he had nightmares because he worried so much about the sailors and the people out there if they were going to suffer from the effects of radiation, because he was very much aware of the consequences. And so they were in a very tough position. That's why the subtitle of my book is Conscience and Complicity at the Dawn of the Nuclear Age. Because on the one hand, they did offer concerns, but then they were constrained in terms of what they could say or do as a consequence of these concerns. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause.